In a land with two moons, memory becomes both weapon and wound. The peninsula of the Palm once stood unified in its fractured beauty, 9 provinces bound not by force, but by shared history. Among them, Tigana, whose very name now whispers only in the minds of those born within its borders. For 20 years, the sorcerer-tyrant Brandon of Ygrath has held half the Palm in his merciless grip, his conquest fueled not merely by ambition, but by a father's grief turned venomous. In Tigana, where his beloved son fell in battle, Brandon unleashed a spell of terrible elegance, erasing not stone or flesh, but something far more precious, identity itself. Those born before remember and cannot speak their home's true name. Those born after hear only a vacant sound when Tigana is spoken, the words sliding away like water through cupped hands. A second tyrant, Alberico of Barbadior, claims the remaining provinces, creating a delicate balance of mutual destruction that has somehow endured. Between these forces moves a scattered few who remember, who carry Tigana's music in their blood, who have crafted their lives into instruments of vengeance. Their paths converge and separate like intricate threads in a tapestry whose pattern only history might discern. This is a tale of magic and memory, of identity when your very name becomes forbidden, and of what remains when everything else is taken away.
It's kind of amazing how plans can change, especially plans that you've made months in advance. Originally, for this March entry in my monthly reading calendar, I was going to read The King of Elfland's Daughter by Lord Dunsany. It seemed perfect. Irish writer, spring magic is sort of a general theme, St. Patrick's Day, you name it. But it just didn't happen. And some of that was just kind of like, I couldn't get the interest together to read it, I'm sad to say. But also, I was getting pulled towards something else. And, you know, sometimes you just got to follow that muse. And so about a week and a half ago, I made my first venture into the works of Guy Gavriel Kay, the fantasist from Canada. Now, I had been interested in reading his work for about 3 years now, knowing his background as an editorial assistant on the Silmarillion with Christopher Tolkien, and then sort of his status as one of the big vanguards of 80s fantasy with the Fiona of Our tapestry during that particular boom. But Tigana tends to be the most immediately recommended book of his, along with a later book called The Lions of Al-Rasan. And Tigana is kind of that book that people recommend for someone who's more of a seasoned fantasy reader, who is kind of expecting a particular kind of like level of fantastical happenings and magic and the like. And I just kind of wanted something like that for the season and as my first foray into his work. Interestingly enough, it seems to be like a work that kind of splits the two periods of his career in twain, from the high fantasy Tolkien inspired stuff of the Fiona of Our tapestry to the more historical fantastical stuff that is kind of, I think, maybe more in line with like a Ken Follett, based on what I've read in terms of descriptors. I haven't read these books yet, but I definitely plan on doing so, having read Tigana. So let's talk a little bit about Tigana. Now that we talked about the plot already, I want to break down some of the things that really drew me into the work and why I liked it so much. I mean, number one has got to be the fact that it's a standalone work. That seems like such a specious, picky thing to say, but fantasy at this point in time is so drowned in doorstop novels. And while I've got other issues with sort of the subgenres that are taking up book space and bookshelf space, I really am sort of bereft by the fact that there's so few standalone works that are available to people who are interested in this kind of literature. You've got people like Susanna Clarke, who occasionally puts out a book, China Miéville, or I think more recently, like R.F. Kuang might be a really good example of someone who is kind of fighting the good fight on that side of things. But Guy Gavriel Kay is really sort of the main vanguard of standalone works now within fantasy. And I think that should be applauded. Interestingly, Brandon Sanderson, who is the big king of like interconnected, gigantic, huge fantasy books that all of them are connected. It's like a multiverse, blah, blah, blah. He has said in interviews that Tigana is his go-to recommendation for fantasy, standalone or not, but he does call it the most brilliant standalone fantasy novel that he's yet read. And I have to say, I'm not the biggest Sanderson fan at all, but he's got good taste when it comes to this. And I think this work really, really proves its mettle based on that recommendation. Setting is pretty cool too. And it really draws me in. I don't know a lot about Renaissance Italy. I've been to Florence with my partner, and it was definitely one of the better parts of our Italian vacation from many years ago. But Tigana is centered on an analog for Renaissance Italy called the Peninsula of the Palm. Really, pretty much the boot is turned into a hand instead, and it has all the same sort of city-states and warring provinces and a lot of the same sort of cultural background that informs the work in a very specific way. Most fantasy is really very Western European centric. So it's cool that there's something that's like a little more Mediterranean inspired. And I think that gives it a very specific flavor that's difficult to find. Maybe Scott Lynch is one of the only other authors I can think of that's doing that same sort of thing right now. But at the center of Tigana is a very cool magic trick. One that if I had my druthers, I really wouldn't talk about at all to anyone before they had a chance to read it. I feel like when this happens, I think it's like 3 or 4 chapters into the book, it like unfurls the book in such a cool, unique way and really opens up the narrative that I think it's kind of a crime that marketing requires readers to know more about the work before they go in. But I also understand that readers need a hook and they need something that pulls them into a book from a writer they're not aware of or they haven't read before. It worked for me. And certainly in my real life, when I describe this book to my partner or my pals, I have to sort of talk a little bit about this idea of Tigana as a country that has been wiped from people's memories and the people that are trying to restore it to its former glory. It's really neat though. And when that happens, it creates a kind of resonance that I think is lacking in a lot of fantasy works. I mean, so much of fantasy is driven by this idea of like a dark conqueror who is seeking a magic sword or magic ring or some magical talisman item of some kind. And the plucky young heroes that have to stop them are these young people, blah, 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 blah. It's the same thing. This is really more of like a real world conflict that is driven by vengeance and is driven by territorial need. And I think it is resonant in a way that so much of the genre just isn't. Particularly if you're kind of politically astute or a student of history, you'll know that tyrants and dictators and fascists, one of the first things they do to countries they conquer is erase the history of the land they're trying to take over, even to the point that the name is being changed. Art, education, people's minds, it's all open to mutation by these external forces. And I think that's what gives Tigana sort of this extra power that really hooked me through all the way to the very last page. Another aspect of Tigana that I think allows it to stand out among the fantasy fray is Kay's approach to well-worn character archetypes. So take Alisson, for example. He's kind of your standard Aragorn analog. He's the last prince of Tigana, the leader of this intrepid band that we spend quite a bit of the story following. But he also is a chief manipulator and also enslaves a wizard that they come across later in the story. And he has no compunctions about it. And it makes you wonder, geez, is he as big a tyrant as the very tyrant sorcerer they're trying to topple throughout the story? Or there's Dianora, who is this concubine who lives with and alongside the sorcerer Brandon. And her whole plan leading up to this moment was to assassinate him at some point. But she started to fall in love with him, surprise, surprise. And that creates this really interesting dual loyalty that we follow. And we learn more about Brandon through her. And we learn also that Brandon is torn with his own sort of moral quandaries, and the fact that he is not just some dark lord, he is a grief-stricken father who struck out in revenge against the people of Tigana because their prince struck down his son, who was a general of one of his armies. And so this gives like so many interesting dimensions to these characters that I think allows the book to feel real and living and breathing in a way that I think is just kind of rare in the genre overall. And lastly, and perhaps chiefly, as a writer, I think this appealed to me the most. It's Kay's ability to kind of just go for it in terms of the narrative construction of the work. So many books in this space, I think they have like really sort of clockwork-like mechanics, and you kind of know like, this is going to be the chapter about this character, and then this character, then this character, then this character, this character. Kay just has a very free-flowing approach, and you really don't know that it's like, it's time to check in with Leonora. It's time to check in with Alberico. No, it really doesn't work that way. And instead, he splits the POVs amongst chapters in a way that really, I think, appeals to his own personal muse. And I find that very refreshing. On top of that, there's a point to which he also is willing to break his narrative completely. This happens at around the midway point of Tigana. And this is where like the spring aspects really kind of struck out to me. And I thought, oh, wow, this is a perfect March book. But there is a kind of short story in the middle of the larger story that does eventually tie into the conclusion of the work that sees one of the secondary characters go into a completely different world and is a part of this very surreal battle that is even larger than anything else that is happening in the book. It is totally unexpected. And it reminded me a little bit of like something Gene Wolfe might do in Book of the New Sun. It's not quite as expansive as like a play within the book or a folktale within the book, but it is so strange and refreshing that it made me appreciate what Kay was doing all the more. On top of that, I think the ending is extremely satisfying. Every loop is looped, every I is dotted, and every T is crossed. It is so satisfying, particularly when a few reveals towards the end happen. I was really pleased. And given that I've read a few books recently where I feel like the endings are kind of the weakest point, it was great to have something that just stuck the landing so perfectly. And I couldn't help but applaud Kay for it. In conclusion, Tigana. It's one of the top 5 fantasy novels I've read. I don't know how else to put it. And appropriately enough, if it's in my top 5, I can only help but give it 5 stars. It lives up to the hype, and I cannot wait to read more of Kay's work. The Lions of Al Rasan, I've got it queued up on my Kindle, so I'll probably read it sooner, but I've also got a paperback copy, because that's just because I'm a crazy person and that's how I do things. Have you read any of Kay's works? Let me know in the comments. Let me know what your favorites of his are, or if you've read Tigana, what your thoughts are about it. I'd love to have a deeper conversation with you guys about this book. I'm so in love with it, and I just can't stop thinking about it. So let me put that energy to better use than just in my head. In the meantime, though, we'll see you next time. As always, like, comment, subscribe. Keep on reading.